I wanted to start by going over, uh, I guess basically, my guess would be the reason why PragerU decided to put out the more recent video that we looked over. The, let's see, the truth about gender-affirming care. My guess is the reason that they decided to do that when they did is because they had an interview with somebody who has been a little bit of a conservative darling recently, who is Chloe Cole, who is a prominent detransitioner. So she's been kind of making the rounds as of late within conservative circles, calling for the people to put an end to gender affirming care whenever possible for younger people. Um, yeah, and so I'm curious to sort of see the rhetoric that they decide to use in this video. So if we come over here, got it pulled up. I think, based on what I know about this, it seems like Chloe Cole was most likely failed in some way through a combination of possibly her doctors, possibly her parents, um, and it also seems like a lot of while it is tragic, it seems like a lot of this is her claiming a lot of things that are not realistic, about things that she was not informed, about things that she expected, um, against all reason. If she had actually been informed as she should have been and was, medically required to be. Uh, but yeah, we're gonna go ahead and start watching this and see what they have to say.
Chloe Cole decided that she wanted to be a boy. At 13, she started puberty blockers and testosterone, and only 2 years later, she had a double mastectomy.
So this is one of the first things that really sticks out to me about the story that is pretty consistent with Chloe Cole is the fact that it's very consistently said that she got put on hormone blockers and then almost immediately on testosterone, which is not how that works. The puberty blockers are meant to give you time to actually be figuring out whether a transition is right for you. So this is a very strange thing that they've decided to run with, that she was put on both of these in the same year. And then 2 years later, at 15, getting a double mastectomy, which I really feel like I can't overstate that would probably take, in just about anywhere in the States, a very high risk, evident in her behavior, that not transitioning would be very bad for her mental health. And so it seems like, to me, it feels very much like there is an incongruency in her story between the way that she talks about how these things went and then how these things actually do go. Uh, so right off the bat, while this part has been consistent in her story, it does tend to bring up some questions for me.
But at 16, she regretted her life-changing decisions. The professionals who are meant to protect her actually encouraged the irreversible harm. Now,
And that's not, I mean, no, they call it irreversible harm. In almost every case, that is not true. As we looked at last time, with the detransition rate being incredibly low, um, where the number of people who actually detransition because they actually do not end up identifying with the gender that they transition to is less than half of 1%, as opposed to the vast majority of people who have a much more positive um, experience with transitioning.
now she has to live with the decisions she made as a child for the rest of her life. Brave Chloe is sharing her story because there are serious lessons to be learned from what has been done to her. So, Chloe, thank you so much for letting me turn on the cameras here in my office. We're having a fascinating conversation about your experience. So, welcome to PragerU.
Thank you for having me.
Your story is so fascinating. You started as a young girl who then decided that you were born in the wrong body. You transitioned from being a girl to a boy and ultimately changed your mind and realized that so much was thrown onto your plate at a very early age. And so I want to hear your story and how everything just got started.
So one of the things that immediately sticks out to me here is the way that this person who is the CEO of PragerU refers to the transition of Chloe, um, explicitly saying that you transitioned from being a girl to being a boy, and then decided to detransition, which is something that they would never grant somebody who transitioned and was happy with their transition. They would never actually grant to that person that they actually managed to transition from being a girl to a boy. They would say something along the lines of, "Okay, so you were born a girl and then you pretended to be a boy for some time," and so already it seems like an interesting difference in the way that this is being approached by PragerU. Most likely because they know that uh, the best way that they can really reach people on this is going to be to attempt to seem it's very much putting on that face of, we're trying to help these people, we don't actually dislike these people, we don't hate what these people do, we just want to help them. And so they're very much playing that up here by not even questioning off the bat whether or not she transitioned to being a boy.
I've got two older sisters, two older brothers, all half siblings from both sides, and they're all older than me, so I did have a bit of influence from them growing up. And because of my older sisters, I liked wearing dresses and skirts and pink and purple and things like that, and playing with Barbies and Brats. But for my older brothers, I also had a bit of a tomboyish streak. Like I liked playing video games with them, and I liked playing with their Legos and toy guns and things like that.
Okay, that's not really that surprising. People who have a lot of older siblings of either gender tend to have at least some sort of tendency towards the things that their older siblings are interested in, just by being in such close proximity.
At what point did you feel like you were a boy?
I am also on the spectrum, and growing up, I did have some difficulties with socializing, especially with other girls my age. I didn't really fit in with them so much as I did with the boys, and
Now, her being on the autism spectrum is interesting because there's a lot of interplay in my understanding between, like, feeling incongruent in your gender identity and also being autistic. These things, the way that autistic people understand social interactions and social roles often tends to lead them to feeling somewhat incongruent in their gender identity based on how they were born. And so that could certainly be part of this. But again, this is not necessarily. I still am having a very hard time believing that the story was as it is told.
when I was younger, this didn't really bother me. But as I got older and I hit puberty and got into middle school, and socializing got more cliquey and gender oriented, I started to wonder, like, if there was something wrong with me, and I didn't know, like, what was separating me from these other girls and why I was different from them.
And I think that's something that a lot of autistic people also end up feeling, regardless of whether that they are trans or not, but also something that a lot of trans people feel. I know that when I was growing up, I had a hard time trying to fit in with guys my age, and always felt much more comfortable around the girls my age, and always had many more girlfriends than male friends, and all of these other things that made me feel like something was incongruent with the way that I was, like, supposed to be living my life based on the way that I felt I should be.
When I was 11, I started using social media.
Is it from
This is something that's interesting because to hit on, because this is something that PragerU hit on in their older video that we watched after their more recent one. um, which basically the entire gist of that one was keep your kids away from social media because it's possible for social media to influence them into this gender ideology. And what we realize it actually is, as we were looking through, is just that as you are exposed to more possibilities for what you can be, if you are one of those things, you're much more likely to outwardly express yourself that way once you realize that that is something that other people do and that there is documentation of, like, this is something that happens to people. People who feel the way that I do identify in this way, and so that means, oh, I guess I'm not crazy for feeling this way. I am able to feel this way. I'm able to express myself this way. It's like how when back in like the early 1900s, it was like forced out of people to write with their right hands. Like you had to write with your right hand. If you were left-handed, they just forced you to write with your right hand until you were right-handed. And then as that became less of a prominent thing to do, and people were able to write with their left hands, the number of people who identified as left-handed skyrocketed over the next few decades and then leveled off at, I think it's about 13%, which is, I guess, what the natural is, or close to what the natural rate is of people being left-handed. And obviously, like the trajectory of it, it seemed like, oh, well, obviously all these people are just being indoctrinated. Look, there were never this many left-handed people before, but there were. They just did not know that that was an option. And so it's the same thing with trans people and social media and being able to see, yeah, okay, I'm not alone. There are other people like this. There are other people who feel the way that I do, and this is how they express themselves. This is what they do. And I am able to do that as well. And so more people are identifying as trans right now. And eventually, as social acceptance continues, hopefully, in society, then we will have, eventually it will level off at whatever the natural rate of people being transgender is. And that, like, very strange climb that people like to point to will no longer be a factor.
Instagram that you came up with the idea that you're possibly born in the wrong body?
As I started to use it more and more often, I was being exposed to images of other young women who were they're very pretty, very, very idealized, and oftentimes they wore a lot of makeup or skimpy clothing, or they had like they're editing their photos, or like they had plastic surgery, and they were like fitting this ideal of like soft features, soft faces, thick, curvy. I started to wonder, like, why don't I look like this?
And that's really tragic. And that happens to a lot of people, whether they're trans or not. They end up finding, when they are exposed to the way that social media tends to work, where you have people posting their idealized selves, the exciting things that they do, trying to make themselves look more exciting than their actual lives are, trying to make themselves look more put together and more fully realized as people than they may actually be in their regular day-to-day life. What you have is people who look at that and don't realize yet that that is what's happening, and so they think, wow, everyone else has such a better life than I do, everyone is doing so much more with their life, something must be wrong with me, when in reality you're just seeing the parts of their life that they want you to see. And so that is really tragic that that happened.
Is there something wrong with me? Like, I was kind of a bit of a tomboy, and I was on the slightly more athletic side, and I had like bigger shoulders, not very developed hips or breasts, and I did have like a little bit of muscle in my body, and it was like, why can't I look like them? Like, I feel like I look like a boy more than anything, and I started to feel like, I'll never be pretty as a girl. Why bother? Maybe I just look better as a boy.
That's interesting. That, to me, does not really sound like a trans train of thought. It's not so much like, oh, well, I will never be considered attractive in the way that I am. So if I want to be attractive, which seems to be the main thrust of what Chloe here is getting at wanting, then maybe I would have better luck being attractive if I were something else, which is not a particularly trans way of thinking. I know a lot of people, it's actually kind of a little bit the opposite in my experience with a lot of trans people, where, like, yeah, I mean, I feel like I was, when I was identifying as a man, I feel like I was reasonably attractive as a man, but then as I've transitioned, I feel more comfortable in who I am, and I feel more comfortable in my body. However, I feel like it is a struggle for me to get to the point where I feel like I can meet the beauty standards of women. And so I think that's an interesting difference in the way that Chloe is talking about it here, where she said, well, I don't look like these other girls, so maybe I would be better off if I was a boy, rather than, God, I really don't want to be like these other girls. I want to feel like a boy. I want to look like a boy. I want to be perceived in that way. That's not what she's saying here, which is interesting.
Roughly around the same time, I also started to see a lot of LGBTQ focused content, especially of people identified as like non-binary or transgender, especially. And it was most often like other girls my age, like aged 12 to maybe like their mid 20s.
I'm actually curious about this because I've seen this now in a couple videos that they've made where they keep saying that the majority of people who are coming out as trans are uh, like teenage trans mask people, and I am not entirely sure if that would actually bear out in the data, but I'm curious. Um, how many trans mask versus trans femme people? Let's see. This is from University of California, San Francisco. How many trans people are there? Estimates that trans women are 1 in every 30,000 people. Trans men are estimated at 1 in every 100,000 people. However, these numbers are likely an underestimate because they only account for trans people diagnosed with gender identity disorder or people receiving services at gender clinics, which we know are not inclusive to all trans people. Okay, so that's interesting. So here it's saying worldwide estimates say that trans women are 1 in every 30,000 and trans men are 1 in every 100,000. So it seems like, at least in the data that we're pulling here, trans women are more, you're more likely to see a trans woman than you are to see a trans man. It seems like most of the time when people are saying that it's more likely to see a trans man, it's people coming at it from the perspective of uh, the gender ideology is making all of these women who, well, in my day they would just be tomboys, but it's making them feel like they could be men instead, and we don't like that. Is their idea there? They don't like that people have the option of going a little bit further than just being a more masculine woman. And so they like to kind of fearmonger about that. Obviously, they fearmonger about trans women in many different ways to that, but that seems to be the main way that they fearmonger about trans men, is just that like they seem to see it as a very anti-feminist. They try to push it in that way where it's like very anti-woman for all of these people who were assigned female at birth to then transition to be men, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with that and has everything to do with them not identifying with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So I think it's interesting that this has come up again, because this is something that I've seen a couple times already.
A lot of them were pretty tomboyish.
Especially with like people like J.K. Rowling. That's one of the big things that they do. Like the TERF ideology, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, who think that gender ideology is taking away the rights of women and taking away like lots of different things from women that it's not doing. It's just allowing women to possibly not be women and allowing other people to possibly be women.
A lot of them were very nerdy and just didn't really like fit in with other girls.
You were searching for kind of a social community and you found a home with them.
Yeah, and I wasn't really in
Okay,
pretty
so this
tomboyish.
is
A lot of them were very nerdy and just 20s. A lot of them were pretty tomboyish. A lot of them were very nerdy and just didn't really like fit in with other girls.
You were searching for kind of a social community and you found a home with them.
Yeah. And I wasn't really like directly involved in the community, but after being exposed to this content for some time, I mean, it was only natural that I started to ponder like my own identity, like who am I attracted to? What is my gender identity? Am I even a girl? And because I never really fit in with other girls my age, and I started to feel like maybe I'm just not a girl. Maybe I'm just a boy.
Okay, that's interesting.
Did you come up with the conclusion that you're a boy on your own?
Yeah.
Eventually?
Okay, so that's an important thing. That the conclusion that she was actually a boy was one that she came to on her own first.
Yeah.
Nobody really pushed me into it.
Nobody pushed her into it, she says, which is not the same as what she has said in other interviews, which I've read about.
And then eventually you were around 11 or 12 when you
Yeah,
concluded that you're a boy.
I was 12.
So 12 years old, and then you basically went to your parents and told them that you're a boy now?
At first, I decided to start the conversation by writing a letter and just leaving it on the table for them to read because I didn't really know how I would bring that up face to face, and I knew it would be like a big shock for them. I was kind of anticipating a negative reaction, so I kind of wanted to allow them some time to think about it. They knew I was kind of a tomboy, but they never really foresaw anything quite like this. And they wanted to support me. They wanted to get to the bottom of this and understand why I was feeling this way.
All right, so it sounds like the parents were supportive of the way that Chloe felt about herself and the way that she was exploring her identity.
And they decided that because they weren't really knowledgeable on this topic, that they would take me to therapists, a team of real professionals who could help us out with this.
Yeah, and that's what you should do if you're thinking that you may be do not identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. If you are looking at possibly finding some gender affirming care in the future, it's generally best to talk about these things with a psychologist of some kind.
My first therapist, he was like, okay, so I'll refer to you by this name that you prefer and call you their son, call you boy, and things like that. And he never really addressed anything that was going on. It was like he never really probed into like what was going on at home or what was going on at school. It was like he wasn't really doing anything, and he actually, I think, either got fired or transferred out of Kaiser.
That's interesting. Okay, so he's showing her like just basic human kindness, which as a trans person is something that I have not always experienced with mental health professionals or health professionals in general, unfortunately. But it seems like he was very quick to do that. And also, it seems as though she was expecting the therapist to maybe pull things out of her rather than for her to actually bring them up. She says that he never really delved deeper into it, but therapy is something that people, go back and forth on in terms of the things that they are communicating. So that's interesting. And then she says that he was maybe fired or transferred out. So that's her first experience with therapy.
And I had a new therapist, and then I was also referred to a gender specialist, I think, who
Okay, and then a gender specialist.
did the diagnosis for gender dysphoria. All right, great. So this confirms what I already know. I already know that I'm struggling with these feelings.
Okay,
I
yeah.
already did a little bit of research on transitioning online, both on like social media and more, I guess you'd say, reliable sources like actual medical resources. All of it kind of said the same thing. Like transitioning was really presented as the only means of treating gender dysphoria, and I thought like
Generally, yeah, if you are dysphoric to the point where you are not feeling comfortable in your own skin and you feel like you would be happier if your body was different than it is, then yeah, that's a very common way for to prescribe treatment for trans people, is to prescribe that they undergo some kind of transition if that's something that they're interested in.
Like, it was the only way forward, and that I was actually a boy.
Well, if this was not something that you were interested in, if it was not something that you wanted to transition, if you said, yeah, no, I think I'm maybe identifying more as a man, but I don't think I want to transition, then there would be no further question about it. Unless you then later showed signs that you maybe did want to transition, that would be the end of that discussion. It wouldn't be like a, yeah, no, I'm not really, I don't know if I'm really interested in transitioning, and they would like force it on you. That's not how that works. It actually is going to take a lot of um, time and consistency from you and your parents and their support for you and your communication with your mental health professionals to actually get to that point where you're going to be prescribed anything that is going to actually have a physical effect on you.
You know, I tried to talk to my parents about this. I was like, I really want to start taking hormones and go forward with like a medical transition. And at first they did push back. They were like, they didn't really understand why I wanted to do this so much. And they're like, you know, you're quite young, and we think that you should wait until you're more competent. And then they
Which, mind you, is what uh, puberty blockers are for. Because if this was at the age of 12, if she had not really gone through much changes with puberty and developing secondary sexual characteristics that show up during that time, then puberty blockers would keep that from happening longer, so that she could then have more time to actually figure this out and make sure this is what she wants, which is, I think, a reasonable thing for people to be interested in, with children especially, with people who are younger, just to make sure that they understand everything about what they're doing before they do it. And the way that you do that is you give them more time to be able to understand it by putting them on puberty blockers.
they had another appointment with the medical professionals, and they were told that, I mean, transition is really the only way forward, and that if I wasn't allowed to go through with it, I would have, they said that I would be at risk of committing suicide.
Okay, well, if this is your therapist that you have talked to and that knows you and that you have talked about this with, and they seem to think that you are a risk to yourself, your own like health, if you are not allowed to transition, that is something that they would have to understand based on their interactions with you, which means either you made them, the way that you were thinking and the way that you were feeling seemed to indicate to this person that transitioning was so important to your mental health that it was something that needed to be done. And that is not, again, I've read a few things about Chloe's story, and this does not seem to line up much with other things that she has said. So that's interesting.
Was there anybody up until that moment that was kind of chaperoning you through this? Or was it basically you reading things online and forming your thoughts and your plan to write a letter to your parents, to move with the transition? I mean, were you kind of like pushing this alone, or what role did the school play in your life?
I'm not entirely sure what the reasoning for asking about the school was, but I was going to say that the after the letter was written and she got into therapy, then the person helping her to work through these feelings and try to figure out what would be best for her treatment wise would be her therapist or the gender specialist that she was seeing.
I was the only one pushing for this, really.
Okay, so now she's explicitly saying that she was the one who was pushing for the the medical transition, that it was not the therapist who was pushing her into it, not the gender specialist pushing her into it, but that she was the one pushing for this alone.
I was basically going off of my own research. And I did have a little bit of influence from other transgender people, but I wasn't like really interacting within the transgender community, and I wasn't pushed into this by anybody. I think one thing that really struck me about other transgender people, especially like the trans identified teenage girls my age, was that they were people who had their own struggles like I did. A lot of them had like family issues, or they were being abused, or like they had like a single parent. They're just like struggling to become what I thought then to be like the best version of themselves. And with every milestone in their transition, from starting on hormones and getting surgery, they just they seem to become more more complete and more happy with themselves. And I saw over time that like their families started to become more, I guess, accepting of them, and they made friends who really seemed to care about them and have their backs. And as a kid, that wasn't really particularly close to anybody in her life, and didn't really have any friends at school. I was kind of touched by this, and it was something that I really wish that I had for myself.
So it seems like, yet again, the focus here from Chloe wasn't so much on wanting to be a man, but wanting to feel like she fit in. And seeing people like her who did transition and then found communities that they fit into seemed to push her in the direction of thinking that maybe she would be better off that way. Again, it doesn't really seem like she had that much of a what's the word I'm looking for? Like a genuine feeling that she was a man, or that she was in the wrong body, and that this would help her in and of itself, but rather that this would help her to fit in with people better, which is, again, not the way that it really works when you're thinking about transitioning.
When your parents and you were meeting with the health practitioners at Kaiser, what was the experience once you started meeting with these professionals?
I think the biggest issue was that there were a lot of things that they didn't tell me or my parents.
I very much doubt that. I very much doubt that, and I doubt that for a lot of reasons. Again, this is something that I saw in other interviews with her, where she says that there were a lot of things that she was not told, including the idea that, I don't know if she'll mention this here, but in other interviews she said that she was not told that if she had a double mastectomy, she would not be able to breastfeed her children in the future. Which I feel like is pretty self-explanatory, especially for somebody who, as she said, was doing research on her own on transitioning, who would have had these very simple things shown to her in all of this research. This story has more holes than that Shia LaBeouf movie. Yeah, it's got a lot of weirdness in it, and it's not. And the problem is, I don't necessarily think that that Chloe is like that Chloe did any of this for a malicious reason to begin with. It just feels like she was confused and was looking for something and was pushing in a direction that she thought would help her, and it just didn't end up being what she thought it was going to be. But it seems like there's just a lot of things that she's like saying were not offered to her that would have been offered to her.
There are studies that suggest that there's a high rate of desistance amongst minors who identify as the opposite sex.
That is just incorrect. That is not true. As we've seen, the very, very few people actually detransition, and the vast majority of them that do detransition not because they don't actually identify with the sex that they, or the gender that they have transitioned to, but because they either have social or economic barriers keeping them from continuing their transition. So even the majority of people who do detransition are not doing so because they no longer identify with the gender they were transitioning to. So, I mean, even if this was true, the data would show that that is not the reason why it's happening. But even beyond that, it's not true that there is a high rate of rescindence.
By the time they reach adulthood, I mean, the figures are anywhere from like a 60 to 90% rate of desistance.
Okay, and I know where this study comes from that is being cited here. And this is a study that I was talking about the other day when we were going over the video, which is a study that was conducted very, very poorly. It was conducted entirely online. And the only way to get to this study, to become a data point in it, it was asking on a website meant for who I would consider to be transphobic parents who were upset that their kids were trans, who were upset that their kids were trans. And so it was like, hey, people who have trans kids and aren't happy with that, uh, did you notice that like a lot of this is just not going right? And this is where they got their data from, was from people who are already like the 1% of people that you absolutely do not take the word of on this. Not even the kids, but the parents of the kids. So it's fucking insane that this is a statistic that they bring up. The actual rescindance rate is close to, I think it's 4% for people who detransition, and closer to 0.4% for people who detransition because their identity has shifted again.
And becoming comfortable with one's body and identity and sex. And I didn't know about this. I didn't even consider that as a possibility. And it was never really brought up. When my parents asked.
And and here's the thing: if the rates of desistance from transitioning were something like 60 to 80%, this is something that you would have heard. The reason why you didn't hear so much talk about it is because the desistance rate is negligible, and the majority of people who begin a transition, the majority of people who go on puberty blockers in adolescence end up fully transitioning. So I don't know. I like, obviously this is sad for her, but it just does not add up.
Asked about like the regret rates, they're basically like, oh, there's less than a 1 to 2% rate of regret.
That is true.
And I mean, they cite studies that are pretty faulty, pretty poorly conducted, and
You see, there now she's talking about studies that are faulty and poorly conducted, when we know that the studies that they use for their figures are actually faulty and poorly conducted. Which, if you want proof of that, you can look at the actual medical consensus on transitioning, which the people who actually understand it from a medical perspective, and how the vast majority of them are supportive of gender affirming care. And you can see that the people who do understand it and have read the literature on it agree that it is a low rescindance rate, which is far and away from being 60 to 80%.
and have a pretty high dropout rate. So there really isn't like a whole lot of data on this in the first place.
Again, this isn't true. Like, there's not as much data as would be nice to have, but there's plenty of data to suggest that it is a very, very low detransition rate.
But I was told like the science is there, it's all done. We've been doing this for decades, and it's fairly safe.
Which is true.
The first endocrinologist I saw actually was really the only physician to push back on this. He said like, you're one of the youngest patients I've seen. I don't know how this might go on to affect your brain development going forward, so I think we should pump the brakes and wait a little bit.
Okay, and that's a reasonable thing. If the doctor is worried about that, then what would happen would be that you would be put on puberty blockers, which would again slow down your puberty, which would stop your puberty in its place, and would give you more time to actually think it through and make that decision. Because again, like taking actual hormones, like being on HRT, will have some like permanent effects on your body. if you are on them long enough. And so the way to make sure that people are um, know what they're getting into and know that that's what they want for themselves, the way to do that is to make sure that they have uh, puberty blockers first if they are too young to really be making that decision yet.
But I never heard this from any other medical professional ever again. It was like I was just immediately referred to another endocrinologist who, after I think it was 2 or 3 appointments, gave me my mom the consent forms to sign off on. And you know, these consent forms, they do list like the side effects, but
Interesting.
they're pretty vague. They're not very comprehensive, and you know,
Okay, now I'm curious. Let's see what the consent forms look like here. So, adolescent um, hormone therapy consent form. Informed consent for testosterone therapy. Let's see. So this is talking about female to male transition. Okay, let's see. This form refers to the use of testosterone by persons who wish to become more masculinized as part of a gender transitioning process. Your initials of the various statements on this form indicate that the risks, as well as the changes which may occur as a result of the use of testosterone, have been explained to you and that you understand them. If you have questions or concerns about this information, you're encouraged to take the time you need to ask for clarification, read, research, talk with staff, and think about the potential effects of this treatment before signing. If you do not understand this information, stop and ask for clarification. So at every point in this, like, this is things that will happen, are likely to happen. We can explain any of it to you in more detail if you'd like. This is just like us putting the things here that you need to be aware of, as any responsible person would. Number one, I've been informed that the masculinizing effects of testosterone therapy may take several months to become noticeable and more than 5 years to be complete. Some of these changes will be permanent, including, so it tells you which of these will be permanent. Hair loss, especially at my temples and crown of my head, possibly male pattern baldness, facial hair growth, deepening of my voice, increased body hair growth, and enlargement of my clitoris, which, yeah, those are things that are not going to change back if you go off of testosterone. Those are things that once they happen, you have them. And that's just something that if you decide, yeah, I've gotten to this point in my transition, I've gotten these effects, and I like where they're at, and I don't think I want to be on testosterone anymore, you can go off of testosterone and retain these things. Like it says, these will be permanent. And then also the non-permanent. So if you stop taking testosterone therapy, these are the things that will go back to normal after you have gotten off of testosterone. Redistribution of fat to a male pattern, i.e. abdominal fat may increase while fat in the breasts, buttocks, and thighs may decrease. Increased muscle development, increased red blood cells, increased sex drive and energy levels, possibly increased feelings of aggression or anger, acne, which may become severe and may require treatment, and cessation of menstrual cycles and suspended ovulation, including changes to /thinning of your vaginal tissue /lining, leading to increased potential for easy damage, dryness, or yeast infections. So it covers pretty much like anything that could reasonably happen to you going on hormones. It says, hey, these are the things that are going to happen. These ones, if it becomes too much, you can stop. You don't have to do this, and these will go back. If you instead decide to go off of them, if you decide to go off of them, these are the things that will not change back. So this is very, like, clearly making sure people understand what they're getting themselves into. I understand that it is not known exactly what the effects of testosterone are on fertility. Yes, I have been informed that if I stop taking testosterone, I may not be able to become pregnant in the future. I have been advised to undergo egg banking if this is a concern of mine. Yeah, again, that's a thing that any reasonable doctor who is talking to you about this is going to mention, which is something that Chloe, again, in other interviews, and probably later in this one, makes it clear that she just did not fully grasp, because she's upset that she's not able to that she doesn't know whether she'll be able to have children at this point, even though it's very clearly stated that, like, yeah, this could affect your fertility. You may not be able to have kids. I understand that brain structures are affected by testosterone and estrogen. This long-term effects of changing the levels of one's natal estrogen through the use of testosterone therapy have not been scientifically studied and are impossible to predict. These effects may be beneficial, damaging, or both. Okay, so yeah, it tells you that. I understand that everyone's body is different and there's no way to predict what my response to hormones will be. I also understand that the right dosage for me may not be the same as for someone else. I further understand that I must follow my prescribed regimen of testosterone treatment to continue receiving hormone therapy at this clinic. I will have complete physical examinations and lab tests periodically as required to make sure I am not having an adverse reaction to testosterone and to continue good health care. I understand this is required to continue testosterone therapy at this health center. I've been informed that using testosterone may increase my risk of developing diabetes in the future because of changes to my ovaries. I understand that the endometrium lining of the uterus is able to turn testosterone into estrogen and may increase the risk of cancer of the endometrium. Not having periods may increase this risk. Continued pelvic exams and cervical cancer screenings are strongly recommended unless there has been a removal of the ovaries, uterus, and cervix. And it goes on like this. It tells you anything that you could possibly be worried about. And if there is anything in this that you do not understand, it tells you to stop and to ask, and that they will make sure that you understand it. You have to go through this entire thing, initial that you have read each and every one of these points, and then like explicitly decide if you want to do it or not. And then you need your patient's your signature and the signature of your medical provider. And if you are underage, you probably also need the consent of your parents, the signatures of your parents. So there are so many barriers here to make sure that this is not something that's going to happen to people. If it did, if all of this, if somehow she managed to get pushed through the system, not understanding anything at all, not ever being explained to that this is like what's going to happen to her body, what could happen to her body, how it's going to affect her in the future. If she somehow managed to get pushed through the system like this, then that's horrible. I don't believe that it happened, but if it did, then yeah, that's horrible. And then she deserves whatever support that she can get. However, even if this all did happen to her, which again, I doubt, even if this all did happen to Chloe, that is one example in a system that is vastly majority, like, good for people, that does so much good for people. And now, because of this one personal experience with the system that, again, seems pretty fishy, Chloe is now an advocate against, like, gender-affirming care in general, for anyone. So, you know, it's very frustrating because I want to feel for this person if this is something that happened to her, but also, like, even if this did happen to you, you have to be able to recognize that statistically, it happening to you is nothing in the broader like scape of what the field does healthcare wise, and that it's very important for millions of other people that these things are available, even if it was not right for you. So I have a very hard time empathizing with this, especially seeing everything that this person must have gone through to get on testosterone in the first place.
So as I was 13 at this point, and I mean teens and kids especially have a habit of thinking like, oh, I'm invincible, like nothing could happen to me. And
Even when it is explicitly told to you what will happen to you, what will be permanent and what will not be permanent.
before I started transitioning, I was like a perfectly healthy kid. I didn't consider what could possibly happen to me really. During those appointments, my endocrinologist asked me, are you aware that you may experience like vaginal atrophy? Are you aware that this may affect your ability to conceive children as an adult? And you know, as a kid, it was just like, oh yeah, yeah, I know. I've done my research. And then
Okay, so if you know these things, and you're not taking them seriously, that is something that should be noted by your parents, your guardians, and by the psychologist that you are speaking to. This is not just something that they will allow you to gloss over.
You know, when she told me about the potential impact it might have on my fertility, it was like, oh no, I don't want to have kids.
Okay? And if that's the case, I mean, again, it even says on the consent form that we looked at that if this is possibly going to be something that you want in the future, it's probably a good idea to have some sort of egg bank figured out so that you have access to fertile eggs later in life if you want them.
Because I was 13, I was a kid.
Yeah.
Like, how could I know?
What a
I mean,
huge responsibility to put on children to make that decision.
And that's the thing. It is not putting this responsibility on children. It is putting the responsibility on children to understand to some extent what is happening with their own mental well-being and what they need and what they want. And then it is put on the parents and on the medical professionals to see to it that that this is the best course of action for this person. And in Chloe's case, maybe it was not. But again, you can't extrapolate this out to the broader medical field.
Right?
yeah.
I mean, not to mention, obviously, parents will consent to having some really fucked up things done to their kids. Like, right when they're born, if they are born assigned male at birth, a lot of parents, especially in the United States, will just, like, absent-mindedly, like, yeah, no, you can cut off, like, part of my child's genitalia. Yeah, why not? That's a normal thing, right? And it's like, it's just, like, the things that parents will consent to are fucking horrible sometimes, and obviously you're not getting the child's consent for that. So at what point are you worried about the child having a say in what gets done to their body? It seems like only when it is politically advantageous for you do you actually care about that.
I mean, I was just a kid. There was no way that I would have been thinking about that at the time.
Except that you were explicitly told to think about it.
So I'm just curious, how fast does it go from you being 11 years old and thinking I'm born in the wrong body to you seeing therapists, then taking hormones, and then going into surgery?
I'd say it was maybe about half a year between me realizing that I felt like I was a boy instead of a girl and coming out to my parents. And then a month or two later, I got diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Between the diagnosis for dysphoria and actually being put on hormones, I think it was just another half a year, give or take. So it was pretty quick.
Okay, so less than a year. Let's see. Average time to get on HRT for adolescent. All right. Okay, so these are the treatment options for gender dysphoria. And let's see where we're going to have these happen. In 2008, the Endocrine Society approved puberty blockers for transgender adolescents as young as 12 years old. Yeah, like we've said, that's what you do for kids to make sure that they actually can figure out what they want to do and make sure that they understand it. Okay, let's see. Let's read through this. The clinically used GnRH agonists are available in the following formulas. Some evidence suggests that children will change their minds as they age. Just under 3/4 of prepubescent children attending gender identity clinics may not want to change their gender once puberty starts. A prospective study of 77 gender dysphoric children referred to one clinic found that after 3.4 years of follow-up, 27% remained gender dysphoric. Cool. Yeah, that's fine. Because as we've talked about, this stage, which is puberty blockers, it has no lasting consequences. 10 studies analyzed the effects of puberty blockers. The median age of starting in transgender males in these trials was 15, and females 15.1 years. They reported the lowest median age in boys of 13.5 years, funded by an unrestricted grant from Ferring. The makers of the study drug triptorelin reported a median age of 13.6 years in transgender females for starting treatment. 6 studies were funded. Let's see. The numbers in these 10 studies are small, and most are retrospective case reports or small case studies. Many are done in single clinics and lack long-term longitudinal outcomes on the effects of puberty blockers. It's also hard to disentangle effects from the use of gender-affirming hormones. Let's see. They concluded further studies should evaluate whether the effects on height and body composition can be reversed during subsequent GAH treatment, where the global functioning after psychological support and puberty suppression was improved, and determined whether the performance on the Tower of London cognitive task was altered, and found no significant effects on test scores. Make it difficult to assess whether early pubertal changes regress under GnRHA treatment and whether prolonged puberty suppression is safe, which is not necessarily true, because again, they've been doing this long before it was done for trans people. They've been doing this for hormonal imbalances in children for a long time, so we actually have a lot of data on that. Let's see, for example, there's a lack of controls, and in one study that included controls, these were inadequate as relatives and friends of the participants were asked to participate, serving as age-matched controls. A lack of blinding is also problematic. Okay. And then, let's see, I want to find when, like, how long does it take to get on, let's see, average time between hormone blockers and HRT. Let's find that. All right. What do puberty blockers do? They can cause puberty's physical changes can cause intense distress for many gender non-conforming adolescents. When taken regularly, it suppresses the body's release of sex hormones, including testosterone and estrogen, during puberty. Yeah, in those identified as male at birth, it decreases the growth of facial hair and body hair, prevents voice deepening, and limits the growth of genitalia. And in those identified as female at birth, treatment limits or stops breast development and stops menstruation. What are the benefits? It keeps people from having to go through the traumatic experience of experiencing a puberty that they don't want. But let's see. Improve mental well-being, reduce depression and anxiety, improve social interactions and integration with other kids, eliminate the need for future surgeries, reduce thoughts or actions related to self-harm. The criteria for use of them show a long-lasting and intense pattern of gender nonconformity or gender dysphoria. Note, long-lasting and intense. Have gender dysphoria that began or worsened at the start of puberty, address any psychological, medical, or social problems that could interfere with treatment, have entered the early stage of puberty, provide informed consent. What happens when they are stopped? Using them pauses puberty, providing time to determine if a child's identity is long-lasting. It also gives children and their families time to think about or plan for the psychological, medical, developmental, social, and legal issues ahead. If an adolescent child decides to stop taking GnRH analogs, puberty will resume and the normal progression of the physical and emotional changes of puberty will continue. What is the typical treatment time frame? For most children, puberty begins around the ages of 10 to 11, though puberty sometimes starts earlier. The effect of puberty blockers depends on when a child begins to take the medication. It can begin at the start of puberty to delay secondary sex characteristics. In slightly later stages of puberty, the treatment could be used to stop menstruation or erections, or to prevent further development of undesired secondary sex characteristics. While most children take the medication for a few years, every child is different. After suppressing puberty for a few years, your child might decide to stop puberty blocking therapy or pursue other hormone treatments. After suppressing puberty for a few years is the general thing here. And this is this person saying from the time that they thought, yeah, I might be a boy, to the time that they were already on testosterone at the age of, I believe they said 13. Uh, they said that that took like a year for them to already be on testosterone. Now, what that means is that most likely she was giving them very good reason to think that in her consultations with psychologists that she was at very high personal risk if she was not able to transition to being a man, which may have been influenced by the fact that she didn't feel like she fit in and thought that that might be the way to help her fit in. It seemed more so like she found a solution and tried to make that fit her problem rather than actually finding a a solution for her problem. And it's really shitty that that happened. It's really awful that that happened, but it does not line up with what we're seeing about how you actually get this care.
Wow. And then you went on the medication, and what did that feel like?
So it started with the puberty blockers, which they put me on for about a month before starting testosterone. So
About a month. That's fucking insane. One, if that's true, what would even have been the point of going on puberty blockers in the first place? If you were just going to immediately transition, if it was so clear that this is what this person needs, that they have to transition now, or they are like a risk to themselves, why even bother doing a month of puberty blockers before you go on to hormones? And also, it's just not something that happens. Like it said, most people are on these for years before they actually decide whether they want to go on hormone therapy or if they want to just have a regular puberty. This just does not line up with reality at all.
to basically clear out the production of the natural sex hormones out of my body to um, make way for the exogenous hormones.
Okay, so it's just to get rid of, I guess they would say, for that month, that it's going to get rid of all of the feminine hormones to make way for the masculine hormones. But again, the time frame here does not make any sense.
And honestly, it sucked. Like it sucked to be on it alone. Once all like the hormones were cleared out of my body, I felt like kind of depressed. I didn't have a whole lot of energy, and I
That's not really surprising. Uh, if you were used to having these hormones and then you do not have them anymore, that can probably lead to some mood changes.
also started to experience hot flashes because it's basically like an artificial menopause. They were pretty sporadic, so I didn't really have any way of like predicting when they would happen, other than like my whole body would get itchy, and then all of a sudden, like I would just the feeling would just like flare up, and I would just be really uncomfortably hot, and it was pretty distracting during class or
So you got on puberty blockers for 1 month. It was miserable for you. And then you immediately started taking testosterone, which was going to have even more effects on all of these things that you were talking about, making you miserable.
whatever I was trying to focus on at the time. And I also started
Again, if any of this is true, then somebody very much failed this person when they were a child, but it just does not seem to line up.
to get this feeling of pressure in my mid to upper back to my neck, and sometimes like I would, if I like breathe in deeply enough, I would hear like a loud crack. That stopped happening once I was a few months on testosterone, but since then I've also developed like some joint pains like in my elbows, my hands, my knees, and my back. You know, once I started on testosterone, it felt great because you know I finally had hormones again in my body, and like I had like my energy back. And
Okay, let's see. What was I about to look up? It was yeah, let's see. Puberty blockers, joint pain. Let's see. This is KHN. What is that? I know nothing about KHN, but let's see. I had no idea why her body seemed to be failing. At 21, a surgeon replaced her deteriorated jaw joint, diagnosed with degenerative disc disease and fibromyalgia. None of it made sense until she discovered a community of women online who describe similar symptoms and have one thing in common. All had been on a drug called Lupron. Thousands of parents chose to inject their daughters with this drug, which was approved to shut down puberty in young girls, but also is commonly used off-label to help kids grow taller. Let's see. Comes with a few warnings. Is also used in adults to fight prostate cancer, relieve uterine pain. Okay. I'm not entirely sure what this has to do with... I'd hate for a child to be put on Lupron, get to my age, and go through the things I've been through. Then, if that's true, then that would be something to look into, to make sure that that's not going to be hurting people. And I'm sure they have other options for it, but let's see here. This is the exact same article, isn't it? We are currently conducting a specific review of nervous system and psychiatric events in association with the use of GnRH agonists, a class of drugs including Lupron in pediatric patients. Let's see. FDA also reviewed deadly seizures stemming from the pediatric use of Lupron and other drugs in its class. While there are other drugs similar to Lupron, it is a market leader, and thousands of women have joined Facebook groups or internet forums claiming that Lupron ruined their lives or left them crippled, but the FDA has yet to issue additional warnings. Meanwhile, pediatricians and industry researchers are criticizing doctors for using Lupron to help kids with normally timed puberty grow taller, and off-label practice. I mean, obviously, yeah, you probably shouldn't be doing that, doing it for off-label reasons. Yeah, off-label prescribing is legal and common, but means doctors are using drugs in ways the FDA did not determine to be safe and effective. Had warned against such use. Among them was a pediatric endocrinologist whose research found that puberty-delaying drugs are widely used off-label, even though the safety of such prescribing is unproven. The health problems described by more than a dozen women could illustrate long-range effects of pediatric use and warrant further investigation. So this was written when? This article? In 2017. So there's probably at least some kind of update on Lupron now. Let's see. Which list adverse effects discovered in studies. There are 2 serious side effects of Lupron that aren't mentioned in the drug maker's 2010 study: a bone disorder and a disease-caused fracture, and a mission which looks puzzling. It does seem that that is certainly a point of criticism. What are they doing? Is this an accident? All right, let's look into Lupron now. Let's go with news. Let's see. Okay, here's a New York Times opinion piece. Let's see what this has to cite. Let's see. And this one, obviously written New York Post, American kids are in the grip of a gender contagion. Let's see. Let's see what this says. Let's see. 2 separate proposals would establish criminal and civil penalties. This is from when? This is from 2022. Let's see. Say the legislation defies the medical field's best practices and represents a grave threat to transgender youth. Under the proposal, doctors who perform sex reassignment surgeries or prescribe hormone treatment or puberty blockers to transgender minors would be guilty of a Class B felony. Let's see. Okay, what is gender dysphoria? What medical treatment do transgender adolescents receive in North Dakota? Receive no gender-affirming medical treatments prior to puberty. Many prepubescent kids experiment with gender ideas, but the majority change their mind when they hit puberty. After puberty begins, children diagnosed with gender dysphoria may receive puberty blockers, age-old drugs like Lupron used to treat a variety of medical conditions. The injections hit the pause button. The effects of the drugs are reversible, and children may undergo puberty normally. If transgender teens forego puberty blockers until they turn 18, the main risk of the injections is a loss of bone mass, but Belf said that the complication is reversible. So we're not seeing anything here about Lupron being bad. Let's see, Lupron, bone pain. I'm not entirely sure what the best thing to look into here would be. Let's see. That's 27. It seems like most of the things talking about Lupron being dangerous and causing a lot of problems are from years ago, and everything more recent seems to be pretty fine. So my guess would be that this was probably something that was spread around by conservatives around that time, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to look into that. Well, let's see.
And there's also just the feeling of, like, this is a big step in my life. This is a big step in the right direction. The physical effects started to come pretty quickly. I'd say after only about like a week or two, my voice started to drop pretty dramatically. My features started becoming more squarish, my body fat distribution started to change, and I developed more muscle. Even my hair and my eyebrows were like getting thicker. It was just exciting to see all the changes, and I felt confident in myself. I felt like I looked good.
Okay. So that does seem to indicate some kind of like actual interest in being more masculine on her part.
How are you doing in school?
Throughout my school years, I did kind of struggle with school a little bit, mostly just like keeping my focus and organization.
And socially?
At this point in time, I didn't really have a whole lot of friends at school because, people at school were like noticing my changing presentation and all the bodily changes and the change in my voice. And I was in middle school, so not everybody was the nicest about it. How people reacted kind of varied by sex. Like some of the girls were pretty mean to me over it, and there was a boy who was kind of harassing me throughout the school year as well. But most of the boys just didn't really care at all. The girls seemed more interested in what was going on, but there was an incident towards the end of the school year where one of the boys who had been bullying me that year had actually walked up to me while I was in a classroom, and he assaulted me. He groped my chest.
Yeah, that's fucked up.
I was in shock, but I kind of just brushed it off. It was like nobody else in the class really seemed to either notice or care, and so maybe it doesn't really matter that much. And I should have, because I wanted to be a boy. It was like I just told myself to man up and get it over with, and I didn't really realize just how much that affected me. And I knew that even if I wanted to speak out, I really couldn't, because if I brought it up to the school office, I knew that they wouldn't really hold him accountable. Like they would probably just give him a slap on the wrist, and then he would come back maybe like a few days, maybe like a week suspension, and he could potentially do something worse to me. So
Yeah, unfortunately, while trans people are like disproportionately likely to be victimized in some way, as are uh, people who are assigned female at birth. This doesn't really have anything to do with trans issues. It's more just people are shitty, which is a pretty wide-ranging thing, unfortunately.
I felt like it wasn't really worth the trouble of speaking out about it, and so I stayed silent. But it did affect me pretty strongly. I mean, I grew up with a really bad fear of being sexually assaulted because a lot of the girls that I knew when they were kids, they were either assaulted or stalked or abused by family members, and I was terrified of having that same thing happen to me. At the time, I was only like 13. I wasn't very developed, and I wore like loose shirts, so I never thought like anybody would really notice that part of me. But that incident just made me very, very, very conscious of that part of my body, and I wanted to hide it from the world. And so I started binding. I used a compression device called a binder, which is basically looks like a tank top. It has compression um, fabric in the chest, and it's for the purpose of basically flattening the breasts and making.
Unfortunately, again, this feels a lot like this is obviously horrible that this happened to Chloe here, but it feels more like when she's talking about using a binder here, it feels very much more like not that she didn't like having um like more feminine features, but that she didn't like other people the way that it made other people act. It feels more like again that she had a different problem that she was trying to solve with uh, treatments that are meant for people who are more gender dysphoric rather than just dysphoric about themselves based on the way that other people interact with them and the way that they connect with other people. I don't know. It seems very complicated. It seems like there was a lot going on with Chloe, but it just does not seem. It doesn't feel to me like most of this is specific to her being trans.
Making for a more masculine or androgynous appearance. I bought my first few binders shortly after that, and I used those for about 2 years before I got surgery.
Would you wear them every day? And what
Yeah,
did that feel like?
yeah, I wore them every time that I went out to school or in public, and I'd wear them for maybe about like 6 to possibly even 12 hours a day. I would work out in them. I would swim in them. It wasn't very comfortable. I mean,
It doesn't sound very
no,
comfortable.
it's not. I mean, some people. I thought it was just fine because some people get like really bad like breast pains or back pains or rib pains or otherwise from wearing them. But I never got that. Like, I thought like it fits well. I bought it from a brand that's supposedly one of the safer brands, so I must be okay. But it actually deformed my ribs over time. You know.
Yeah, you're really not supposed to wear binders for like a whole lot of time at a time that consistently. I'm not entirely sure about the claims of it deforming her ribs, but yeah, it definitely can be bad for you over time to wear a binder pretty consistently.
Because I was still developing. I was still growing. It's kind of a graphic way to describe it, but the way they work, they basically push the breast into the rib cage, and I mean, this causes all sorts of issues. The effect wasn't immediately noticeable to me. I didn't realize this until after my breasts were gone. I was like, "Hey, what's going on with my rib cage? Why is it like flaring out like that?" And I figured out it's because I used the binder while I was growing.
Okay, let's look into that. I'm curious. Um, no, sorry. That's the wrong effect of wearing a binder. Binding can affect skin, muscles, and movement, particularly over long periods of time. Tightly covering the skin and chest with material that don't allow free-flowing air can create warm, moist environments for bacterial and fungal infections. Let's see, what happens if you wear a binder every day? You should avoid wearing your binder for more than 8 hours a day, especially if you use it every day. Over time, wearing the garment for long hours can actually break down tissue and cause breathing problems, back pain, and skin irritation. So we're not seeing anything about rib deformation. Um, okay, let's see. Um, where was it here? Symptoms. Getting a properly sized binder will prevent complications. If your binder is too small or too tight, it can restrict breathing, irritate your skin, break skin around the edges of the binder, cause overheating, bruise or fracture your ribs. Even if your symptoms aren't severe, long-term use of a poorly fitted binder can lead to chest and back pain. Change binders if you experience any pain while wearing your current binder. So this sounds like what I was kind of assuming it was, which is that, as she said, she was still developing, although if she was on hormones at the time, she should not have been uh, further developing in that way. But as she said, she was. So the way that she's talking about it, it sounds like she had a binder, then that binder became too small, but she kept wearing it anyway instead of getting a new binder. And yeah, if you're doing that, you're going to probably end up causing yourself some damage.
At what point did you decide to go get surgery, and how old were you?
I was I was 15. I was in my sophomore year by this point. By the time I entered high school, I was already on testosterone for long enough. Nobody really even knew that I was transgender, save for people that I went to elementary school with or people who I was a bit closer to. Um, but after like a few years of using the binder, it really sucked, and I wanted to stop. I wanted to be free of that, and I
And I mean, that's certainly a reasonable thing to want to be free of, even if it's not causing you damage. It is not exactly fun to have to uh, wear specific things or do specific things in order to keep yourself from feeling dysphoric, if you can avoid that. But yeah, again, the way that it was affecting her was a little bit more extreme based on the fact that she was not wearing a properly sized binder.
I really truly believed that I was a boy, that I was just like any other boy my age, and I wanted to look like other boys and be able to like take my shirt off without worrying.
What is the process from making a decision that you don't want to have the breasts anymore to actually going to surgery? So, did you meet with a pediatrician, or do you go directly to a surgeon? How does that work?
So I first talked about this with my therapist, I believe. I was referred to another gender specialist who then sent me to a gender-affirming surgeon. When I had an appointment with the surgeon, when I was waiting in the office, they had like pictures of post-op results of their, they called it top surgery. It's really a double mastectomy.
I mean, yeah, there's nobody pretending that it's something different. It's just the generally people who are calling it top surgery are getting it done for different reasons than people who are getting a double mastectomy and calling it that. But that's kind of just like a colloquial difference.
It was, it was all like people who were pretty well healed, like they're all things considered, like their scars and everything looked just fine, and
And it
there
seemed
was like
like they were doing a lot of them. I mean, was it like, oh, there are a whole
yeah,
bunch of people
yeah,
here who
yeah.
are
There was like a lot
removing
of
their
pictures.
breasts?
There was a lot of pictures up. It kind of reinforced this idea that it was just like part of the process and just
Oh, a
a
lot
Which it can be for a lot of people.
of people
normal
are doing
thing.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, after that appointment with the surgeon, he was like, "Hey, you may want to attend this top surgery classroom that takes place in the hospital building." And I said, "Okay." And I went to it. It was basically for minors and their parents to attend to learn more about top surgery and all the different kinds of incisions and how it works. And
That was
So you were recommended to attend and did attend something with your parents that specifically laid out exactly what was going to be happening with your top surgery and exactly what to expect. So I'm assuming, hopefully, that there was not anything that you're going to say later about how you were not informed about things.
was
it
just going to
was,
ask you that. Were there a lot of other minors there getting top
yeah,
surgery or breast removal?
yeah. It kind of shocked me, attending that class actually, because as soon as I sat down, I like looked around the room and I noticed there were maybe like 12 to 15 other girls in there, and I noticed like pretty young, and most of them looked to be much earlier in the process than I was. I don't think most of them were even on hormones yet, and they were already considering surgery. That was
Okay, being aware that surgery is a possibility for you in the future and educating yourself about it is not the same as being setting up a surgery, gender affirming surgery, years and years and years before it happens. Those are not the same things, nor is it going to be the case that somebody who is not along in that process is going to be getting a gender affirming surgery at that point.
kind of a shock to me, but it was also, well, I guess I'm not the only one.
Yeah, because you have a place that is doing this sort of seminar on this, and all of the people who are around that area who are interested in it, who may be trans, are probably interested in learning about it when they can. So you're going to have, I mean, yeah, I think seeing 12 or 15 other people at this specific class that they're doing for trans people, uh, yeah, I think the people coming around from that area, that would make sense.
Yeah, I guess that's the feeling that they kind of want to give to you,
Yeah.
right? And so you spoke with your parents, and together you decided to move forward
hmm
with the surgery. And then once you had the surgery, what were you happy then? What was it what you were hoping to achieve?
I remember the day of, I was pretty excited. Like it was a big step for me, and um, I remember being wheeled into the operating room, and I was pretty nervous. I still felt pretty confident about it. You know, it was like I didn't have any doubts about it until after it happened. But there was like a young male nurse in the back of the room, um, preparing something, and I saw him like look back at me, and he looked very concerned, kind of like, what am I doing? How old is that kid? That's a kid right there.
Okay, so now you're assigning thoughts to somebody based on a face that you saw them make. I'm not hearing any actual confirmation that this person was not okay with what was happening.
I didn't really understand what his face meant at the time, but
But since I have decided that gender affirming care for minors is not something that should be happening, I have now interpreted that face to mean something that supports that.
I guess you look back now and you remember the original doctor and some of the nurses looking at things and thinking that it's strange. And now,
And it is strange. It is very rare for somebody at the age of 15 to be getting top surgery, I feel like. For the most part, that is not something that's going to be happening at that age. And so, in order for that to be happening at that age, again, you're going to have to, as the person getting the top surgery, have really made it very evident this is something that is very important to you and that you are not going to be doing well mentally if you are not able to transition further.
now it's kind of coming back to you.
yeah, I was pretty confident that this was going to work out for me, and I was looking forward to it. And when I woke up and all the medication wore off, and I was ready to move around and go home, it was like, wow, I feel great. Like I'm so happy. You know, by this point, it was a major surgery on the upper part of my body, so I lost a considerable amount of my range of motion. I couldn't even lift my arms up.
Yeah, that's normal. It does take a lot of time to rehab from any surgery, especially ones that are going to be dealing with large portions of your body. Yeah.
Until like 2 or 3 months after the fact. And after that period, I had to get my stitches taken out, and it was like, you know, the surgery had severed a lot of nerve endings and blood vessels, so the sensation was not quite right. It was very numb, but I could still feel like everything that was happening, and it made me physically sick having to deal with that. I mean,
Yeah, that's also pretty normal. When you're getting stitches out with the way that the nerves are not really attached correctly and everything, it does feel very numb, and I can definitely understand how that could make somebody feel a bit sick.
I got really nauseous when they were doing that. We had to stop.
But that would be the case with any major surgery, not just with a gender-affirming surgery.
About midway through, and then once I got home and I had to start bathing again, it also meant that I had to start taking care of these incisions and wounds on my chest.
Which, again, you went to a seminar that was explicitly telling you about the different things that were going to be happening with this surgery, and would almost certainly have told you a lot about what you were going to have to do after the surgery in order to stay healthy.
And it was hard just to take my shirt off, take the compression device off, and remove and reapply all the dressings and just see what was underneath. I could barely look at myself. The post-op period has been pretty rough, and I don't think it's anything that any 15-year-old should have to go through.
Certainly not if they were not informed about it beforehand and did not understand it beforehand. If this is something that somebody wants, and it seems like their doctors are agreeing with that, and everyone seems to be on the same page, then I mean, it's not going to be pleasant for anyone to deal with post-surgery healing. However, this doesn't really have anything to do with you being trans, because any surgery could be something like this. It could be a necessary surgery that, in many cases, a child is not even going to be having any real say in whether it happens, because it's just going to be like, yeah, you need to have this surgery, and they're just going to go along with it. They're going to have a lot less information about it than somebody who is going through the process of seeking out gender-affirming surgery. It just, again, it just does not feel like she approached any of this in a way that was conducive to, like, actually understanding it and knowing what she was getting into, but it sounds like she was given every opportunity to.
Frankly, I also missed out on a few events and social opportunities like parties and group outings and stuff like that, and I
As you will do when you are recovering from surgery.
just couldn't leave the house because I was basically disabled. I wasn't really in a state to be going out on my own like that, and it really sucked, and I started to feel the sense of isolation. And during my next school year, COVID came up, and they started doing all the lockdowns and distance learning and stuff like that, and that really reinforced the feeling of isolation that was already there tenfold.
Yeah, no, I can see how that would happen. I could see how all those things would pile up, but also, this does not change anything about the reasons that you got the surgery in the first place. It just sounds like you did not like dealing with it afterward.
And I started to withdraw because I wasn't really interacting with the outside world, and I couldn't really go out. And I started using the internet a lot more often. I started like being exposed to like these images of other women again, and subconsciously I started to realize like I miss looking feminine, I miss looking pretty, and didn't realize it at the time, but I was starting to regret my transition. I didn't like the way that testosterone was making me look anymore, and I wished for a more feminine form, and I secretly started to buy like makeup and skirts and women's clothing again.
It sounds to me like most likely Chloe was probably trans to some extent, probably not really a cis woman, was probably a non-binary person to some extent, was probably had some kind of dysphoria with femininity, but also then found that they had some dysphoria with being too masculine. And my guess would be that they're probably somewhere in the middle. And because going through with the transition for them, which again, it feels like they kind of needed to push for against people who were unsure about it, um, especially if it all happened this quickly, which again is not normal. It feels like this person, Chloe, went too far too quickly because she was pushing for it. And yeah, I think eventually, I think it's fine for people to say, yeah, maybe we can take a little bit of time to think about this. And especially at that age, and that's why we have things like hormone blockers. That's why we take the time to do this, and we are not getting put on hormone blockers and then getting put on hormones a month later, and then getting top surgery a month, like a year later. Like, this is just not the timeline that this happens on, and this is why, because it helps people to not end up in this situation.
I would just like wear it like in my room without anybody really knowing. I wouldn't tell anybody about it because I was so ashamed of myself. It was it was a hard thing to admit, but I didn't really fully realize my regret with my transition until 11 months after my surgery. I was in a lot of distress by this point. I wasn't really performing well at school. I was starting to not really even attend my online classes, so my parents decided to put me in a different program for school. One of the lessons I had was on like child development, child psychology, and maternity, and I learned that breastfeeding was not only a means of feeding your child, but it's also one of the main ways that as a mother you bond with your kid. And I mean, I never really thought about this before. This was really the first time that I ever really thought about being a parent, even.
I mean, again, you had to be informed that, yeah, you might not be able to be a parent. You had to know that, yeah, you're not going to be able to breastfeed if you do not have breasts to breastfeed from. You had to be made aware of all of these things. And again, it sucks that this is a conclusion that you had to come to afterward, but it's not supposed to be that way, which is why this is not the time frame that these things happen on.
Because I was a kid when I consented to all of this, and I wasn't really focused on things like that. I was worried about like school or fitting in or getting my assignments in, but I never really thought like about how being a parent would look for me one day. Deep down, I had like a maternal instinct that wasn't really fostered at all because I was being socialized as a boy. I believed myself to be a boy, and I was developing like a boy because I was on cross-sex hormones. I started to realize like what was really taken from me.
Wow.
You see, she says what was taken from her, but she also says that she was the one who was pushing for all of this. Even when other people were, like, even the medical professionals at some points were advising her to slow down and think about things, but she clearly made it very obvious that this was something that she needed to have very quickly, or she would be some kind of risk to herself, because there's no other way that this happens.
I realized one day that I really regretted my entire transition, every single step of it, from the hormones to the blockers and the surgery especially, because that was the most irreversible part about it. And I didn't really know what life would look like for me going forward because I knew that much of my transition was going to be irreversible. I didn't even know like if I was ever going to look like a woman again, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. I just broke down crying, and I called a friend of mine to talk about it, and I wanted to talk to my mom about it. I couldn't bear to do that face to face though because I didn't want her to see me with like the tears streaming down my face and the stress that I was in. I had a lot of shame and guilt about this because I mean, it was this thing that I was invested in for so long, and everybody around me knew me as like their son or their brother or just a boy, and I no longer looked like a woman. I didn't know. It was hard to admit that I was wrong, and especially when everybody else around me supported me. I didn't know what to do. I,
It sounds like there were definitely a lot more deeper psychological issues that were not really taken into account here in this story. Like, it seems like the way in which her desire for this transition and the way in which she first went about it, wanting to fit in rather than wanting to be a boy, wanting to or starting wearing a binder and being uh, interested in surgery because of being assaulted. It feels very much like this is not normal. Nothing about this is a normal like trans experience all the way throughout, and neither is the way that the process happens so quickly. None of this is normal, and I think it's horrible that this happened here. But I think it points to something much deeper in Chloe that needs to be addressed, rather than an idea that the system itself, which again has a very very low detransition rate, could possibly account for.
I just stopped taking the hormones, and I just kind of stayed confined to my room and my bed. It did help that my mom and dad would come to my door to check in on me and like bring me food and snacks and things like that. It was comforting, and I think that was one of the biggest things that kept me going.
They supported you no matter
Hmm.
what.
And you know, I didn't really have any friends in person by this point. Like the lockdowns and distance learning had basically like torn apart all my friendships, and the only friends I really had anymore were online, and I would talk about my feelings online.
It kind of just feels like she felt isolated, and she thought that she might feel less isolated if she transitioned. And then we went into a an unprecedented pandemic where she was even more isolated after getting uh, her gender affirming surgery, and then she still felt um, very isolated. And so she it feels like every decision that she has made this entire time has been driven less by dysphoria and more by a desire to fit in with people just in general.
About my about regretting my transition, how I hated how it made me look and how it made me feel. I was kind of shocked because I was actually met with a lot of hatred from other transgender individuals.
Your friends online were transgender
Yeah,
individuals, part of a transgender community.
yeah,
You see, and as a trans person watching this and hearing about this, I think it's horrible that this situation happened to her if it happened as it is laid out here. But the problem is, and the problem where she was probably getting some discomfort from her other trans friends, was when she made the transition from thinking that it wasn't right for her and that she was not uh, taken care of in the way that she needed to be in the system, to then making that everybody else's problem, where all of the people who go through this process and who have these transitions and then their life improves, she is now fighting against the right of those people to have those experiences that improve their life because of something that happened to her. It just feels very very much like I had a bad experience, which means now anyone who is having a positive experience must be the one who's wrong, even when that is the vast majority. And it's, I guess I can understand how somebody would get to feeling that way. It feels unfair that so many people are seeing things that you wish that you had seen for yourself, but they're seeing them for themselves. And I can understand being jealous of that, but that does not warrant then turning heel and deciding that the people who need this healthcare still should not have access to it.
yeah. I had friends who were kind of all over the board. A lot of people who were straight, gay, transgender, conservative, liberal.
And so when you told them that you regretted what you were doing, what was their reaction?
I mean, I had a few friends who actually saw this coming and they felt guilty for not speaking up. A lot of my other transgender friends, I think it's kind of like awoken like a new fear in them, because most of my friends who identified as transgender were either like very early in the process, like they were only socially transitioning, they weren't on any hormones yet, or they were just starting on hormones. So seeing somebody like me who transitioned young and was so far into it, I think that that was kind of terrifying for them. And there was also like a little bit of jealousy because of that, I think. And some people decided that they just couldn't handle these feelings and that they would attack me over it. I was told things like, "Oh, you weren't a kid. You knew exactly what you were doing to yourself. You were informed. This wasn't an experiment. You weren't wronged. You did this to yourself."
In every legal sense, as long as you were given all of the information that you were supposed to be given, yes. You and your parents both consented to all of the changes that you knew were going to be happening to you, that you were explicitly informed were going to be happening to you. You not liking that after the fact does not change the fact that you did, in fact, consent to it, along with your parents, while fully informed. If that was not true, if you did not get fully informed, then I think that's horrible. But everything that I can find here seems to indicate that there is very little possibility that you were not informed properly about what you were getting yourself into.
They told me that if I kept talking about this, then it would make everybody else uncomfortable and it wasn't bringing any benefit to anybody. It would just damage the community of real transgender people with real dysphoria. And
You see, and that's interesting because again, it feels like when you talk about the reasons why you transitioned, I think one of the reasons why people may be saying these things is because the way that you felt about yourself is not the way that most trans people feel when they are feeling dysphoric. The way that you described it was not in a way that is familiar to most trans people. You were describing it as feeling disconnected from people socially and trying to remedy that by not really wanting to be a man, but by feeling like you might have a better chance at remedying that in congruence with wanting to have more like more interaction with people, that you might be able to fix that by having a gender transition. It just does not line up with most with like the majority experience. And so yeah, I can see how that would make people uncomfortable.
stopped speaking out about it. But during that period of time, though, I was also starting to naturally question like what happened and challenge my own views. And I was also interacting with other people online who either desisted or they stopped transitioning after a medical transition, or they're in the middle of like questioning their transition. And I realized like this isn't as uncommon as I thought it was. And this
I mean, it is as uncommon as it is, and just because you have examples of other people that you know does not mean that it is any less statistically uncommon. Just like you specifically having a bad experience does not change the fact that the vast majority of people do not.
is a very real thing.
And the majority of people who do have a bad experience trying to get trans healthcare are people who are not given the trans healthcare that they need, rather than given it too quickly or too easily.
And that's happening. And now that I'm going through it myself, I'm being silenced. And that's not okay. I realized what was going on and I stopped giving in to the pressure of other people, and I started speaking about it again, at first on my social media and to friends and family, and eventually I decided to start speaking out on Twitter publicly.
In what ways were you being silenced, and what are you doing to kind of push against that?
It was mostly social pressure from other transgender people and even some individuals who call themselves like gay or trans allies. People who had never been through the process telling me like, "You're being a TERF, you're being a transphobe, you're bigoted, you need to stop
Or they're
this
like
right now."
dismissing you?
I mean, you can be trans and be transphobic. You need to look no further than some of the very large conservative figures who are both trans and transphobic. People like Blair White, who have so much self-hatred that they would rather stoop for the conservatives than actually live like around people who accept them for who they are, because they don't accept themselves for who they are. And this, it seems like with you immediately going to people like PragerU and people like Tucker Carlson, who I know you've also had an interview with, and all of these other people, it just seems like you are now trying to. It seems now like you're making an active effort to then become all of the things that these people were worried that you might be.
Or
Yeah.
something. At first, they were the most tolerant people in the world, and suddenly they're like so intolerant because they don't
Oh, I
like what you're
know.
saying
Yep.
now.
My dog has joined the stream. She's hanging out.
Yeah. And so you've taken on a big responsibility now to try to help others through the pain that you went through. I just think I mean, you're so amazing. It's hard to believe that you're 18 now.
Yeah.
You're 18. It's just hard to believe you're so young, but you've taken on a big responsibility, and through the adversity and pain that you went through, you found strength, which I think is so incredible. I mean, first
See, the problem is instead of trying to protect people from an actual larger problem, she's trying to protect people from a problem that statistically doesn't exist but happened to affect her. And so she is then putting her experience onto what the entire community experiences. And that is just not something that is borne out in the data and is not something that is going to help anyone.
of all, you're beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say that. And secondly, you're also beautiful inside because it takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. I know you're getting a lot of heat and pressure.
And also going and talking to some of the most uh, wealthy and influential conservatives in the country with this story. Yeah. All right, give me just a second. I'm gonna go let this dog outside. Yes, I know. I'll be right back. All right, the problem child has been dealt with. She is enjoying the very cold weather outside because she is a husky. But she will be doing just fine out there while we finish this up.
And so just tell me, what are you hoping to achieve now with this new journey that you're going on?
The system that's in place right now, the affirmative care system, it's very one size fits all. There's never like any regards to any alternatives to transitioning or
This is not true. While transitioning is right for some people, a lot of people transition to different degrees. A lot of people want to have hormonal transition but don't want a surgical transition, or want to only have some effects of hormones, or don't want hormone treatments at all, or like there are so many different ways to go about being trans. The idea that you are discouraged from anything other than a full transition, even when you like explicitly said that uh your physicians were advising you to slow down and wait and think about the things that you were doing a little bit more, is absurd and untrue.
treating dysphoria. And that's what leads to cases like mine. They're not really considering like any comorbidities. Like I didn't even know that I was autistic until after I stopped transitioning. And over the course of my transition, I actually developed more psychiatric issues.
That doesn't surprise me. Like I said, from what I'm hearing, it seems like there are a lot more deeper psychological issues here that are causing a lot of the distress that you're feeling that have nothing to do with being or not being trans. And I mean, mental health services in our country are fucked to begin with. However, keeping people who are trans from actually accessing trans healthcare is not helping anyone. Because even if it did not work for you, it does work for the vast majority of people who end up actually seeking it out.
There needs to be a better assessment for who transition would work out for and who it might not. And I really don't think that
And that starts with not going from hormone blockers to HRT in a month.
it's something that children can consent to. I mean, it's something that affects pretty much every area of your life. I mean, even in ways you wouldn't even think of. Even if they did give me like the full picture of what could happen to me, I wouldn't really have been able to really fully comprehend what it all meant. I didn't really have the mental faculties or life experience to be able to make that kind of decision. It affects every area of your health, from your general health to your reproductive health and your sexual function. Children just aren't really equipped to be able to do that kind of thing.
which is why they are generally given many, many ways in which they can slow down the need to make a decision, such as hormone blockers, and why these transitions generally take quite a long time, because you need to actually give yourself the time to make sure that this is what you want to do before you start making permanent decisions, which is why the story that you've given just does not happen. It may have happened to you, but it does not happen in general, which is a good thing because it shouldn't happen that way. However, making these things less available than they currently are is just going to lead to more people getting hurt.
And you're suing Kaiser.
Yes,
Tell me a little bit about the lawsuit.
I'm suing for negligence and medical malpractice.
And I'm curious to see how that goes, because if she was given full informed consent, if she was given all the information that she should have been given, then I don't really see a case there. I can see a case that the conservatives will make, but I don't see one that is actually well reasoned. I see a case that I'm sure will be made, but not one that I think should be. And depending on how this goes, I'm curious to see how the different responses are to it.
What they did to me was wrong, and it's most certainly not for children. And on top of that, I wasn't fully informed of the full extent of how transition could affect me.
And if that is true, then I think you have a case, but I also very much doubt that that is true. And my guess would be that there are very explicitly endorsed um, papers to prove that you and your parents were explicitly informed on what was going to be happening.
How can we help you? How can the people who are listening help you?
I think the most important thing to do is to just keep spreading the word about what's going on.
How are you funding?
When she says what's going on, what she means is what specifically happened to her and does not generally happen, but what conservatives want to spread as being the main story in order to further their cause of keeping trans people from existing.
This lawsuit? It must be incredibly expensive to sue Kaiser.
I do have a donation fund set up.
It's like a GoFundMe or something.
It's on my attorney's website, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Another part of what I'd love to know is there's the court of law and there is the court of public opinion, and you're doing both, right? You're suing them in the court of law, but you're also speaking about your experience. And can people follow you? You have like an Instagram.
And her experience might win some people over in the court of public opinion, but my guess would be the people who are going to be won over by this statistically insignificant thing that happened to one person are people who are already going to be on that side of the issue.
I do have Instagram and YouTube, but my main platform is Twitter. My username is CHOOOCOLE.
And are you planning on going back to school?
I do want to go to college. I am taking one class right now, but I do want to take more classes, and I think I want to eventually go on to get a degree. I'm not really sure what, I mean, I just don't really know what I want to do yet. There's so many
So
possibilities.
normal for an
but-
18-year-old. I mean, what you're already doing is so much bigger than what any 18-year-old would do.
And I like doing it.
Yeah. You and I had a conversation just before we sat down as we were walking in here, and I think is one that's really worth sharing with people out there. And that is when you're a young girl, but even a grown woman, you can't expect to look at yourself all the time and feel like you're everything you were hoping you would see, right?
Especially in the age of social media.
Exactly. I mean, I look in the mirror.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You should not be forming your own feelings of self-worth based on what you see of other people. That's true.
And I'm critical of myself, and so this idea that you can look at yourself and just see everything you're hoping that you would see as you see on social media, and then live in this kind of, you know, alternative virtual reality. It is no wonder why young folks are struggling like that. And so the idea that people are turning immediately to surgery or changing their gender is so dangerous. And I want anybody who is listening to us to know that from both of our experiences, mine a little longer than yours, None of us can always feel like we're everything we're hoping that we would look for. And that is not even something that we should strive towards. We should
Absolutely.
strive towards being happy with who we are, with the gifts that God has given us. And this whirlpool that you stepped into because you were looking at yourself and you were looking at the images on social and saying, well, I want to look like that. And if I don't look like that, I'm therefore not a woman, is so wrong. There
You see, and that's not what she said. Not that she wasn't a woman, but that she better might have a better chance fitting in as a man because she did not fit in as a woman, which I feel like was a misguided place to start for all of this, which seemed to kind of set the pace for where this entire story ended up going.
is no woman out there, not even a supermodel, who looks at herself and says, I'm this perfect looking being. Nobody
Yeah.
feels that way. And so, if you're listening to this conversation, I want you to know that nobody ever feels like they look perfect. And that is totally fine because we don't need to look perfect. And we should certainly not think that we need to change our gender because we don't look like some avatar on social media.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest faults of our world today is that we've become very focused on vanity rather than things that really matter, like our contributions to the world around us and our communities and our families.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you so much for your openness and your courage. You're incredible.
Yeah, this is very sad, and I think the saddest part about it is not even really. I mean, it's very horrible what happened to Chloe here, if everything that she says is accurate to how it happened, even though some of the things that she said are a bit contradictory, but even if we assume that this is exactly how all of this happened, it's very upsetting that this is something that she had to deal with. I can see how that would be horrible to have to deal with, and I'm sure that our the world would be a better place if we had better mental health capabilities of making sure that everyone was getting what they needed. If our mental health system was a little bit more fleshed out, if it was a little bit less difficult to get into and figure out what you need, I think that would help out a lot of people, including somebody like Chloe. But I think the bigger societal harm being done here is the idea that because this is something that happened to Chloe, that this is now a like a warning to all other people who might seek this out, despite the fact that statistically speaking, Chloe is the far outlier. Even if all of the things that she says are true, then that means that she did not even receive all of the proper information, which means she was not even fully informed in her consent, which she, again, has not really given any reason to believe that that's the case other than just her saying it. But if that's true, then that even more so discredits the idea that the people who are actually giving their real informed consent and are actually getting all of the information are not able to make this decision. It's just it's very unfortunate to see something bad happen to somebody and then to have to oppose them because the way that they are handling what happened to them is by then victimizing other people who statistically would not have this happen to them, but statistically may benefit from the things that she is trying to stop from continuing. It's very sad to see, and I would hope, although I doubt it based on the people that she has decided to talk to, I hope that Chloe can eventually find some kind of closure in this and some kind of understanding of who she is and acceptance of that. But it doesn't seem like she really has much of an interest in that as much as she has an interest in, like she has indicated throughout this story, feeling like she belongs. And now that she feels like she belongs within the conservative anti-trans movement, I feel like that's probably where she's gonna stay, because that's how that tends to go. It's just disappointing to see. And I wish that this was not something that we had to deal with, but unfortunately it is.